Since the first airplanes, there were people who desired to take them to sea. Eugene Burton Ely was one of those people. He demonstrated the idea by taking off from the U.S. Navy ship USS Birmingham on November 14, 1910. 2 months later, he made the first landing on a ship, the USS Pennsylvania. This demonstration would serve as one of the inspirations for the aircraft carrier, which would first see action in World War I. On July 19, 1918, the modified battlecruiser HMS Furious launched the first carrier-launched airstrike in Todner, Germany, modern-day Todner, Denmark. This would inspire American admirals to follow in the British's footsteps and create their own aircraft carriers, which would predominantly see action in the Second World War and onwards. The USS Langley was originally built as USS Jupiter. Jupiter was a collier ship, or a coal transporter ship. Her sisters were Cyclops, Proteus, and Nereus. All three disappeared without a trace. Jupiter was ordered to be converted on July 11, 1919, and decommissioned on March 24, 1920. Jupiter was then converted into America's first aircraft carrier at Norfolk Naval Shipyard and renamed the USS Langley on April 21, 1920. The Washington Treaty limited tonnage and firepower of aircraft carriers. However, ships lighter than 10,000 tons are still in service or under construction, such as the Langley, were considered experimental and didn't count. Langley was recommissioned on March 20, 1922. Her main role was testing new ways of launching and landing aircraft. As an experimental aircraft carrier, she only carried 36 aircraft and only had one elevator and one catapult. Initially, the catapult was meant to launch seaplanes, but proved effective in launching land planes. Due to the short flight decks of Langley and every carrier since, they needed wind over the deck to help launch aircraft, but the catapult would later help launch aircraft into the wind. Langley was later converted for a second time, this time to a seaplane tender on October 25, 1936. On February 29, 1942, the USS Langley, USS Whipple, and the USS Edsall were attacked by 16 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. The encounter ended with the Langley taking 5 hits from 250 and 60 kilogram bombs. 16 of her crew were killed and the ship was damaged. Captain Robert P. McConnell ordered to abandon ship. After rescuing Langley's crew, the Whipple and Edsall scuttled the Langley to prevent him from falling into enemy hands. Her wreck has yet to be discovered. Although Langley's career wasn't that long, she provided experience to her successor, the Lexington Class. After the success of Langley, the Navy decided to convert 2 battlecruisers that were under construction. The first 2 of the Lexington Class battlecruisers, Lexington and Saratoga, were deemed the right choice. Everything about Lexington and Saratoga dwarfed Langley. At 37,000 tons, 90 aircraft, 2 elevators, 4 twin 8-inch guns, and 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, they were monsters. They would be the largest carriers until the Midway Class in the late 1940s. They were also the first carriers capable of combat operations in the U.S. Navy, as the Langley was a test ship and was too slow for combat operations. They were also key in developing the tactics of carrier warfare and developed ways of using their air groups against each other in mock exercises. These would prove helpful to the U.S., as those tactics would help defeat the Japanese in World War II. Unfortunately, both ships were victims of bad luck. Lexington was sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier battle in world history. She was scuttled to prevent capture. Lexington's wreck was finally discovered on the bottom of the Coral Sea on March 8, 2018. Saratoga was hit twice, once in mid-January 1942 by Japanese submarine I-6, which caused her to miss the Battle of Midway. She was hit again shortly after the Battle of Eastern Solomons by Japanese 126 on August 31st of the same year. She would serve most of 1944 as a training ship before being recalled to the frontline service in early 1945 as the U.S. Navy's second dedicated night fighting carrier. Saratoga only served her new purpose for several days. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, Saratoga was hit by kamikaze. This forced her back to the U.S. for repairs. Due to her being obsolete, Saratoga would serve out the rest of the war as a full-fledged training carrier. When she was older, Saratoga was deemed a target for nuclear weapons during Operation Crossroads, which were a pair of tests conducted to determine the effects of nuclear weapons on warships. Saratoga survived the first test, Able, but was sunk by the second test, Baker. Recently, Saratoga's wreck had become a tourist destination for scuba diving, making her one of only 3 aircraft carrier wrecks in the world with that distinction. Although the Lexington Class were big in their own right, most of the Navy thought they were too big. As a result, the Navy would commission the smallest carrier to sea combat, the USS Ranger. USS Ranger was the first American carrier first built from the keel up. She could only carry a maximum of 86 aircraft, but was normally limited to 76. Not only that, but her speed was also a factor on why she never had combat duties in the Pacific. However, she did participate in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. She was originally built as a flush-deck carrier, meaning she didn't have an island. Her island wouldn't be added until after completion. Because of this, her smokestacks were placed on the aft part of the ship, 3 on each side of her flight deck. This caused a problem when launching and landing aircraft, as smoke would cover the flight deck. To solve this problem, her smokestacks were designed to change their angle when launching and landing aircraft. She was also one of the first ships in the US Navy to be armed with light guns to defend herself against enemy aircraft. She was armed with 40-50 caliber machine guns and was also armed with 8 dual-purpose 5-inch 25 caliber guns. The Ranger is the only carrier from the US to survive the war without confronting the Japanese fleet. She was decommissioned on October 18, 1946, and scrapped the following year. As with Langley, Lexington, and Saratoga, Ranger was a lesson learned. Bigger was better. Ranger's size meant she could only carry a small number of aircraft and gave her a slow speed. Because of these drawbacks, the next carrier class would be bigger. After the commissioning of the Ranger, the US Navy had 54,400 tons of steel left over to build carriers with. With the limits set in place by the Washington Treaty in mind, the US Navy decided to build the Yorktown Class carrier. The 3 ships of the class were the USS Yorktown, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Hornet. These ships were based on the Ranger, but were larger. All 3 ships were built at Newport News Shipbuilding Naval Shipyard. All ships in this class made their mark in history. Yorktown was one of 2 U.S. carriers to participate in the first carrier versus carrier battle, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Hornet launched B-25 bombers for the first air raid against Japan. Enterprise would become the first carrier to launch a nighttime raid and would become America's first nighttime carrier. Yorktown was damaged at Coral Sea, but by some miracle, she was repaired in 72 hours, and she, along with her sisters Enterprise and Hornet, participated in the Battle of Midway. Unfortunately, Yorktown was damaged and later sunk around June 7, 1942. Hornet lived a little bit longer, but was sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz and left her older sister, Enterprise, as the last ship of the class. Hornet was the last CV carrier sunk to enemy action. Enterprise had a longer career than her sisters. She survived the war and was the youngest of 3 pre-war carriers to do so. Despite being the most decorated ship of World War II, she was scrapped in 1958. In between Enterprise and Hornet was CV-7, otherwise known as the USS Wasp. USS Wasp was the only ship of her class and was built on what was left of the tonnage from the Washington Treaty. Unfortunately, Wasp was fatally flawed. She, like Ranger, was slow and lacked basic armament. This would play in her eventual downfall. Wasp was commissioned on April 25, 1940. At first, she was seen as too small for service in the Pacific and stayed in the Atlantic. In 1942, she was transferred to the Pacific, where she would be torpedoed during the Battle of Guadalcanal by a Japanese submarine, I-19. Unable to save the ship, she was scuttled by other American ships in the area. Her wreck was located on January 14, 2019 by the research vessel Petrel. The carrier sits upright in 14,255 feet of water, though parts of the hull appear to have split. The Saratoga, Ranger, and Enterprise would become obsolete due to the carriers that followed the Wasp and Hornet, the Essex Class. The Essex Class carriers were the first carrier class not restricted by the now useless Washington Treaty. They were meant to be 33,000 tons fully loaded, but ended up at 36,380 tons fully loaded. By 1944, they had set the standards for the carriers at the time. Due to their size, they were the first carriers unable to transit through the Panama Canal. At least 4 of the new carriers were named after carriers sunk earlier in the war: USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, USS Lexington, and USS Wasp. The Essex Class was the largest aircraft carrier class in history, with 24 being completed. Of those, 5 are still in existence, 4 of which are in museums: USS Yorktown at Patriots Point, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, USS Intrepid in New York City, USS Hornet in Alameda, California, and USS Lexington at Corpus Christi, Texas. The fifth ship, USS Oriskany, was scuttled in 2006 to form an artificial reef off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. She can be visited by experienced divers. The rest of the ships in the class were scrapped. Most ships of the class were modified with upgrades under the designation SCB-27 and SCB-125 to help them operate jets. Most saw service during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and a few were used by NASA for the Mercury Redstone 3, or Freedom 7, the United States' first manned spaceflight. Freedom 7 was recovered by USS Langley Champlain on May 5, 1961. This would not be the last time an Essex Class carrier recovered a NASA craft, as the USS Hornet would recover Apollo 11 in July 1969. Even while Essex Class ships were being built, their successors were in the works, the Midway Class. Midway Class ships were larger than Essex Class ships, but only slightly. With a displacement of 45,000 tons, the 3 ships that were completed were then the last ships built with a straight flight deck. The 3 carriers that made up this class were USS Midway, USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, and USS Coral Sea. Midway and Coral Sea were named after 2 famous battles from World War II, while Franklin D. Roosevelt was named after the 32nd President of the United States. Midway was commissioned on September 10, 1945, 8 days after the Japanese surrender of World War II. By 1947, all 3 ships were in active service. USS Franklin D. Roosevelt was decommissioned early on September 30, 1977, followed by Coral Sea on April 26, 1990, then finally Midway on April 11, 1992. Both Franklin D. Roosevelt and Coral Sea were scrapped in 1978 and 2000, while Midway became a museum ship in San Diego on June 7, 2004. With the detonation of the atomic bomb in 1945, the Navy wanted a carrier that could carry nuclear weapons, so a plan was put into place to build America's first supercarrier, but it wouldn't be without controversy. The USS United States was to be America's first supercarrier, but due to conflict with the new U.S. Air Force, the Navy lost the funds to build the United States to the Strategic Air Command, or SAC. SAC wanted to build a new bomber called the B-36, or Peacemaker. The U.S. Navy knew the plane would be a failure and called it the $1 Million Blunder. Construction had begun on the USS United States, but was cancelled 5 days later after the keel was laid down due to the new bomber. This also caused what would be known as the Revolt of the Admirals, where many admirals, including William F. Halsey and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, resigned in protest. Ultimately, the USS United States was scrapped due to budget cuts before she was ever constructed. The Navy would finally receive its supercarrier with the Forrestal Class carriers. The reason why the Forrestal Class carriers were called supercarriers is because they were 25% heavier than the Midway Class. The USS Forrestal was the victim of an infamous fire on July 29, 1969. While off the coast of Vietnam, a major fire broke out. A Zuni rocket installed on a F-4 Phantom misfired, impacting an armed A-4 Skyhawk's side. The rocket's impact dislodged and ruptured the Skyhawk's 400-gallon external fuel tank. Fuel from the leaking tank caught fire, spreading and burning for hours, killing 134 and injuring 161 sailors, flight crew, and flight deck personnel. 21 aircraft were destroyed and cost the Navy $72 million. This, along with some small fires, caused the Forrestal to gain the nickname USS Zippo after a famous lighter brand. The other 3 ships of the class were USS Saratoga, USS Ranger, and USS Independence. Ranger was the first to go on July 10, 1993. She was decommissioned, followed by Forrestal on September 11th of the same year. Saratoga was decommissioned on August 20th, 1994, then Independence on September 30th, 1998. All ships of the class were scrapped in the mid-2010s. Both Forrestal and Saratoga were scrapped in 2014, Ranger in 2015, and Independence in 2017. The next class of carrier would mark the end of an era, one dating back to the Langley. The main differences from the Kitty Hawk class and the Forrestal class were greater length and the location of the aircraft elevators. 2 of the elevators were forward of the island, the command post of the ship, and 1 was behind the island. The 4th one was moved from the forward flight deck to the aft port side. Kitty Hawk and her sister Constellation would be the last carriers built in shipyards other than Newport News Shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. Kitty Hawk was built in New York Shipbuilding Corporation, Camden, New Jersey, and Constellation was built in New York Naval Shipyard, New York City. The 4-carrier class served out the remainder of the Cold War, but due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the funds were not there to keep them in service. The first to go was USS America. She was decommissioned on August 9, 1996. The next to go was USS Constellation on August 7, 2003, followed by USS John F. Kennedy on March 27, 2007, then finally Kitty Hawk on May 12, 2009. The USS America was the target of a controlled scuttling on May 14, 2005. This was done to test how a carrier would handle battle damage. Constellation was scrapped in 2015. John F. Kennedy and Kitty Hawk were both sold for scrapping on October 6, 2021 for 1 cent, which is the bare minimum for purchase. Kitty Hawk departed the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard under tow en route to Brownsville, Texas for scrapping on January 15, 2022. As she is too big to transit the Panama Canal, she will instead go by way of the Straits of Magellan. It is unknown at this time when USS John F. Kennedy will set sail on her journey to the scrapyard. Kitty Hawk was the last conventional power carrier in service with the U.S. Navy. This was due to the successes of one ship that would later set the standard for all new carriers, the USS Enterprise. Right off the bat, Enterprise earned the nickname Big E due to her large size, measuring at 1,123 feet long. The reason she was made so large was because she was the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier and the only one built with 8 nuclear reactors for propulsion. She was not only the longest warship in the world, but she was also one of the fastest, keeping with her motto, "We are legend, ready on arrival, the first, the finest, 8 reactors, none faster." Enterprise was built at Newport News Shipping Yard and commissioned on November 25, 1961. The Navy determined right away that because she was so expensive, not to build any more of her class, making her the only ship of her kind, but she was about to show that her reactors would make her a great weapon. Enterprise performed so well in Vietnam that Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford decided to reverse the Navy's decision not to build any more nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. On January 14, 1969, while training off Hawaii, an accidental explosion cost the lives of 28 sailors and injured 314 others. The fire started when the exhaust from an MD-3A heated a Zuni rocket until it exploded. This started the chain reaction of explosions that would cause further damage to the ship. Despite this, Enterprise would return to action after 51 days of repairs. Enterprise would see action from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Iraq and Afghanistan in her final years of service. Enterprise is also notable for her response to the events of September 11, 2001. She was heading home from watchdog duty in the Arabian Gulf when she found out about the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Captain at the time, James A. Sandy Weinfeld Jr., informed the crew the last time America was attacked, Enterprise's predecessor, CV-6, was the first American asset to strike a blow for freedom, and they would be given the same chance to do the same. Enterprise sailed for the coast of Pakistan, outrunning her escorts. On October 7th, she was the first American carrier to strike the Taliban in the war on terrorism. In late October of the same year, her deployment complete, Enterprise sailed for home. According to Weinfeld, it's always an emotional event when an aircraft carrier comes home, when 5,000 to 6,000 sailors arrive home with all their families on the pier and the like. This is probably a notch above that. It was like walking into a college football stadium with the crowd cheering when the ship pulled in. Enterprise served for 50 years before deactivation on December 1st, 2012, and decommissioned on February 3rd, 2017. Enterprise currently rests at Newport News Shipping Yard until a plan to scrap her can be determined by the Navy. Enterprise's service may be over, but her legacy led the Navy into the nuclear carriers era and paved the way for the Nimitz Class carriers. Named after Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the USS Nimitz and her class were the first nuclear-powered class of carriers and also the biggest, weighing 101,600 to 106,300 tons. The Nimitz Class carriers have since become the standard class in the U.S. Navy. Nimitz Class carriers only have 2 Whitehouse A4W nuclear reactors compared to Enterprise, which had 8. The 10 carriers that make up the Nimitz Class are USS Nimitz, USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, USS Carl Vinson, USS Theodore Roosevelt, USS Abraham Lincoln, USS George Washington, USS John C. Stennis, USS Harry S. Truman, USS Ronald Reagan, and USS George H.W. Bush. Beginning with USS Theodore Roosevelt, the aircraft carriers were manufactured with modular construction. This meant that whole sections could be welded together with plumbing and electrical equipment already fitted, improving efficiency. Using gantry cranes, the modules were lifted into the dry docks and welded. This method was originally developed by Ingalls Shipbuilding and increases the rate of work because much of the fitting out does not have to be carried out within the confines of the already finished hull. Due to them having nuclear reactors, Nimitz carriers have unlimited range and are only limited by food and fuel for her crew and aircraft. They only have to be refueled twice on an average lifespan of 50 years, which means every 25 years they must be refueled. Half of the 10 carriers have finished their refueling process, with the 6th, USS George Washington, about to complete her refueling process, and the 7th, USS John C. Stennis, about to start hers. One of the first major operations Nimitz-class ships took part in was Operation Eagle Claw on April 24, 1980, the failed rescue mission of 52 embassy staff being held hostage in Tehran. The USS Nimitz made her way to the Indian Ocean in response to the situation. Nimitz ships also participated in humanitarian missions, such as Operation Fiery Vigil, in which the USS Abraham Lincoln and 22 other ships helped to evacuate civilians in Luzon Island after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. More recently, the USS Carl Vinson was part of Operation Unified Response. Carl Vinson provided aid and drinking water to the people of Haiti after the devastating earthquake in 2010. Some ships of the Nimitz class have been involved in the War on Terror, such as Carl Vinson and Theodore Roosevelt. Both ships participated in Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001, with 2 ships launching some of the first airstrikes in Afghanistan. John C. Stennis and George Washington were also involved with their role in Operation Noble Eagle. Both ships carried out Homeland Security operations off the U.S. West Coast. Even before the final Nimitz-class carrier was completed, there were plans to replace Enterprise and the older ships of the Nimitz class. This would lead up to the most modern class the U.S. Navy would have for aircraft carriers, the Gerald R. Ford class carrier. Gerald R. Ford class carriers are nuclear-powered carriers currently under construction. This class will act as the replacement for the current Nimitz class, with the last Nimitz ship scheduled for decommission in 2058. Currently, the only Gerald Ford class carrier ship in active service is the lead ship, the USS Gerald R. Ford. Construction on the Gerald R. Ford started on August 11, 2005. She was built at Newport News Shipbuilding, the only shipyard in America that builds nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Originally, there were only 3 Gerald Ford carriers authorized for construction, but if the class wants to replace the Nimitz class, they'll need 11 ships total. On April 6, 2009, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates announced that each Gerald R. Ford ship would be built over 5 years. However, this changed in December 2016, when Navy Secretary Ray Mabus signed a force structure assessment calling for a 355-ship fleet with 12 carriers. If enacted, Gerald Ford class ships would have to be built in 3 to 4 years. The other ships of the Gerald R. Ford class are USS John F. Kennedy, USS Enterprise, USS Doris Miller, and CVN-82, not yet named. The John F. Kennedy is in the final stage of construction, while Enterprise and Doris Miller are currently under construction. CVN-82 is scheduled to be laid down in 2027. For 100 years, the United States has been constructing and implementing aircraft carriers into their Navy. No other nation has had an aircraft carrier in their fleet for that many consecutive years in a row. The British record is 96 years, for example. The U.S. Navy is also the only current nation that operates 11 aircraft carriers, more than 5 times more than the next nations, China and Great Britain. American carriers are the heart of the U.S. fleet. They also play a key role in exercises such as the naval exercises off Hawaii known as RIMPAC. RIMPAC, or the Rim of the Pacific Exercises, is an international warfare training exercise held every even-number year in Honolulu. Australia, Canada, and the United States have participated in every RIMPAC to date. France, Japan, South Korea, and various other nations have also participated in RIMPAC. U.S. Navy carriers are usually the heart of RIMPAC exercises. When some people think of carriers, they think of them as warships only capable of combat, but carriers have been used in search and rescue, deterrence, and peacekeeping missions. The only other ships with more hospital beds than the Nimitz Class carriers are USNS Mercy and USNS Comfort. In fact, they serve as the hospital ships for their respective fleets. It was also due to America's increased interest in aircraft carriers during World War II that America became the world's largest navy. As author Jonathan Parshall once said, "No one knew how carriers were supposed to operate. Pearl Harbor really was the initial battle that sort of announced the beginning of the carrier age of warfare. Leyte is the battle that announces that there's only one navy in the world that's really capable of doing that sort of warfare, and it's the US Navy."